Mrs. Honey's Hat by Pam Adams. Mrs. Honey had a hat. On Monday, she wore it when she took her grandson Peter to the park. She bought him some bubble gum and sat on a bench with her knitting. Peter thought, "Those feathers would make my arrows fly better." So he pulled the feathers off the hat and his bubble gum stuck to the brim. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Tuesday, Mrs. Honey wore her hat to visit a friend. They sat outside in the shade of a tree and ate cake while they chatted. Some birds flew down to pick up the crumbs. "Those cherries look good," they chirped. So they flew off with them. One little bird left some eggs behind, but Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Wednesday, Mrs. Honey spent a day at the beach. The sun shone, the sand was hot, and the water was perfect. Mrs. Honey felt very happy. Afterwards, Mrs. Honey took off her hat and sat in the sun. A hermit crab thought, "That shell would make a nice new home." So he scuttled away with the shell and left some seaweed behind. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Thursday, Mrs. Honey picked dandelions to make wine. It was very hard work. She took off her hat and put it on the fence. A cow in the field saw the hat on the fence. "What a beautiful big buttercup," she mooed. So she took a mouthful and her bell fell onto Mrs. Honey's hat. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Friday, Mrs. Honey went to see an old castle. "Just look at those cobwebs," exclaimed Mrs. Honey. "This place could do with a good cleaning." A big black spider dropped onto her hat. "Hurrah!" it said. "This lace will make a good strong cobweb." So he hurried away with the lace and left all his old webs behind. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Saturday, Mrs. Honey took her cat to a cat show. There were all sorts of fine cats, but she hoped that hers would win first prize. An alley cat saw Mrs. Honey's hat through the window. "That ribbon might help me to win a prize," he thought. So he pulled it from the hat and left some fish bones behind. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Sunday, Mrs. Honey went to church. Everyone seemed to be staring at her. "Whatever can it be?" she wondered. "Perhaps it's time I bought a new hat." After the service, Mrs. Honey hurried home to look in the mirror. Then she noticed the bubble gum, the eggs, the seaweed, the bell, the cobwebs, and the fish bones. "Goodness," she exclaimed, "I've got a new hat." But she wasn't sure that she liked it. A Child's Play Story Sack turns a book into a whole set of multi-sensory experiences that are interactive. Each resource in the sack has been carefully chosen and developed to enhance the reading experience for children and adults alike. Each sack contains the storybook, dramatisation props, generally a CD, a game and non-fiction book that relate to the story, and a booklet with activity ideas and language extension and comprehension. Mrs. Honey's Hat is a cumulative story with a lot of humour and repetition, and it's ideal to be read to pre-readers or to be read by early readers themselves. It's predictive. Each page begins with "On a day of the week, Mrs. Honey," and ends with "But Mrs. Honey didn't notice," and it helps children learn the sequence of the days of the week. The Mrs. Honey doll and hat decorations can be used in conjunction with the story or as an activity by itself to remember the story and the order of the changes of the hat. You start off with the original pieces on the hat and they get changed as the new pieces get put on. Mrs. Honey's Hat Lotto is a basic lotto game with round boards, which are just like her hat. It has reinforcement of the story and the days of the week on the back of the boards, and you use it as you do a normal lotto game and match the pictures of the original things on her hat. Then, as a memory game, you put whatever replaced that original piece on. Those two pieces are the same shape as each other, but different from the shapes of the pieces for each of the other days of the week. So the cards can be used as a separate game, quite separate from the lotto game, as categorising, matching and sorting game. The non-fiction book is one of our range of misunderstood creatures, spiders. This is a wonderful three-dimensional concertina-style pop-up book which gives a great deal of information on spiders and their habitats. It can be used like a normal book but with very unusually shaped pages. It can also be used to paperclip the covers together and hung down from the ceiling as a display, or as a display behind a theme table on spiders or other creatures. The reason that the spiders book is in the story sack is because on Friday the big black spider took the lace off Mrs. Honey's hat and replaced it with a cobweb. The booklet is a generic guide to the story sacks. There's one in each sack, which explains the type of resources that are in the sacks, how they can be used individually and together, and the type of skills that the children will achieve through general activities. Then there's a separate sheet for the particular story sack with activity ideas and language extension and comprehension for that story. There are 4 other Mrs. Honey books: Mrs. Honey's Glasses, Mrs. Honey's Holiday, Mrs. Honey's Dream and Mrs. Honey's Tree. They can all be used to talk to children about getting older, the fact that just because you're getting older means you can't do anything. And also Mrs. Honey's Hat is available in Greek. The Mrs. Honey's Hat story sack is suitable for use with children from around about 2 years of age up to around 8 years of age.